The corridors of Caligula's palace did not echo with politics or reason. They echoed with begging, with the desperate, hollow voices of Rome's finest, pleading for mercy that would never come. Under his rule, the empire's elite discovered a new kind of terror, one that didn't come from swords or armies, but from the slow, deliberate cruelty of a man who wore power like a god's mask. Fathers auctioned the innocence of their daughters. Husbands were forced to smile as their wives were degraded before crowds. This was not madness, it was method. Every act of cruelty had a form, a fee, a procedure. Rome, the heart of civilization, had become a factory of humiliation. To understand how the greatest empire on earth reached such depths, we must return to the beginning, to the moment a smiling young man was hailed as Rome's hope. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The world would know him by another, Caligula. The name came from the tiny soldier's boots he wore as a child, a symbol of innocence that would one day mock the empire that adored him. Born into privilege, son of the beloved general Germanicus and the proud Agrippina the Elder, Caligula's early life seemed destined for greatness. The legions worshipped him. The people adored his family. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, poisoned, many whispered, the boy learned his first lesson about power. Love in Rome was temporary and loyalty was only real until it became dangerous. His family was torn apart. His mother was exiled, his brothers imprisoned or executed, all under the paranoid gaze of Emperor Tiberius. Caligula survived by pretending. He learned to smile when afraid, to flatter when disgusted, to seem harmless when plotting survival. Behind his calm eyes, he studied the machinery of tyranny. When Tiberius died and Caligula ascended to the throne in 37 CE, Rome rejoiced. He was young, charismatic, educated, the living symbol of a new dawn. He cut taxes, freed prisoners, repaired roads, funded public games, and greeted people in the streets. The Senate relaxed. The people celebrated for 100 days. To them, it felt like the Golden Age reborn. The gods, they said, had finally sent a ruler worthy of Rome. But the gods are rarely generous for long. In the autumn of that same year, Caligula fell gravely ill. The illness consumed him, fevers, delirium, convulsions so violent that men had to hold him down. When he recovered weeks later, something inside him was gone. The warmth in his eyes had turned to something cold and predatory. The young emperor who had once spoken of justice now spoke of divinity, his own. He ordered that the heads of every statue of every god in Rome be replaced with his own likeness. He began calling himself a living deity. Those who laughed died quietly. Those who praised lived miserably. Servants whispered of his sleepless nights, wandering the palace gardens, muttering to the moon, digging in the dirt with bare hands, claiming to be planting Rome's destiny. What he was really planting was the foundation of a reign defined not by chaos, but by the systematization of cruelty. It began close to home with his sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. To him, they were not family. They were extensions of his will. His obsession with Drusilla was the most disturbing. He called her his goddess, his Diana, his equal. When she died suddenly in 38, he broke. He declared her a divine being and enforced an empire-wide mourning period so absolute that laughter became a crime. Anyone seen smiling was executed. His grief was not love, it was fury. Death had taken something he considered his property. From that moment, his cruelty found purpose. He turned his gaze toward Rome's nobility, reshaping corruption into policy. What followed was not random depravity. It was a bureaucratic machine of degradation, engineered with precision. Noble women were summoned to the palace, their husbands and fathers forced to attend. What occurred in those halls was recorded, categorized, and priced. Each act was entered into ledgers as if it were a state expense. The emperor himself observed, noting reactions, cataloging obedience and resistance. These notes became tools of control. A senator who smiled too broadly at his wife's humiliation found favor. One who hesitated found his son missing, returned days later mutilated, a message carved in flesh. In Caligula's Rome, neutrality did not exist. Physicians, scribes, and guards became administrators of his cruelty. Official documents described examinations of women as state fertility assessments. Payments were labeled voluntary contributions. Everything had a name, a number, and a seal. Even horror was taxed. Caligula called his palace the temple of divine service. To him, these weren't crimes, they were rituals. Each chamber was named after a god. The room of Jupiter, where he enacted his dominion as a divine being. The chamber of Venus, for forced ceremonies disguised as mythic reenactments. The hall of Priapus, for punishments beyond reason. The walls that once echoed with the debates of senators now carried the cries of Rome's most powerful, reduced to silence. Behind the marble, a hidden bureaucracy thrived. Scribes, guards, accountants, physicians, midwives, all recording, organizing, and classifying the emperor's violations. Every victim had a file. Name, age, rank, physical description, acts performed, duration, result, fees paid, pregnancies recorded. It was cruelty turned into clerical order, and it worked because everyone had something to gain. Wealth flowed through the system. Merchants sold ointments and perfumes to victims. Priests blessed the emperor's rituals. Poets wrote verses turning atrocity into divine myth. Silence was profitable. Complicity was rewarded. Soon, the empire itself became addicted to this dark economy. The machine of depravity grew, fed by fear and greed. Husbands became collaborators. Fathers signed documents consenting to the divine service of their daughters. The Senate, once Rome's moral backbone, passed laws that sanctified humiliation. One decree declared that the emperor's body was sacred, that union with him was an act of worship. Through legal words, Caligula transformed violation into piety. Families became the instruments of their own ruin. The case of Senator Cornelius became legend. When ordered to surrender his wife, he refused. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found alive but mutilated on the Senate steps, the emperor's message carved into his flesh. By dusk, Cornelius brought his wife to the palace himself. Months later, she conceived by imperial command, and Cornelius was forced to recognize the child as legitimate, renouncing his other sons. Rome's lawmakers applauded the decree that made every child of the emperor, born by any means, superior in rank to lawful heirs. The shame of one man became the law of the empire. Beneath the Palatine Hill, a secret archive grew. It contained registers more detailed than military reports. Victim names, pregnancies, miscarriages, the dates of ceremonies, the revenues each one generated. Hundreds of clerks filled these ledgers with steady hands, transforming agony into data. Each official told himself he was only a functionary performing a role. None claimed guilt. Together, they formed the body of an empire that had forgotten the meaning of conscience. Caligula's nights became theater. He turned cruelty into spectacle. On full moons, he transformed a private amphitheater into what he called the lunar temple. Senators' wives, gladiators, slaves, and even trained beasts performed in grotesque pageants. Husbands were ordered to sit in the galleries, forbidden to show emotion while their wives were disgraced below. The emperor directed every motion with a gilded baton, his commands silent but absolute. Scribes documented everything, names, times, and the emperor's comments, so that even memory became evidence. Rome's social elite learned that survival required obedience, that silence was the only prayer left. Around the palace, a shadow economy flourished. Apothecaries sold forbidden drugs to dull pain. Secret physicians offered procedures to undo what could not be undone. Tutors coached victims to appear willing. Gold flowed in every direction except mercy. Greed became the empire's heartbeat. Caligula's cruelty wasn't chaos, it was design. He wanted to prove that nothing was sacred, not love, not honor, not the family itself. He destroyed each one in turn. He forced mothers to witness their daughters' degradation, then forced the daughters to watch their mothers suffer. He narrated these acts like a poet performing mythology, claiming he was reviving the old tales of gods who ruled through violation. To him, he was not desecrating Rome. He was remaking it in divine image. Resistance was almost impossible. Some victims attempted to take their own lives. Others disfigured themselves, hoping to be spared. But imperial physicians were experts in recovery. Bodies were repaired and returned to service as lessons for others. Caligula declared that beauty was irrelevant to divine purpose. Even the wounded could serve. Escape was an illusion. Those who fled were hunted by informants, dragged back to the palace, and made examples of in ceremonies so cruel that even his guards averted their eyes. Yet the system endured because it worked. The bureaucracy kept order, the treasury overflowed, the fear was absolute. In the Senate, Caligula often read selections from his own ledgers aloud. He called them reports of divine justice. Fathers and husbands sat frozen as the emperor recited the cold details of what had been done to their families, entry numbers, durations, payments. Laughter in those chambers was gone forever. Even those who hated him most learned to applaud. Among the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect him, resentment grew. They were not innocent. They enforced his rule and often shared its spoils. But constant humiliation turned loyalty into hate. One guard, Cassius Chaerea, endured years of mockery from the emperor. Caligula taunted his voice, ordered him to perform demeaning tasks, turned him into a court jester. What began as wounded pride festered into something darker.